Ice cubes clinking in a glass. I mean, we see it every single day, right? But in this explainer, we're taking a seriously deep dive. We're going on a trip from that totally ordinary ice cube all the way to cutting-edge thermodynamic theory that is literally rewriting how we understand matter. Freezing is just one of those everyday things we completely take for granted, but the physics behind it, absolutely wild. So let's start with what seems like a basic question. What actually happens when a liquid turns solid? It sounds simple, but the answer to this one, fundamental phase transition, it governs pretty much everything. It drives massive global weather patterns, dictates how life survives extreme cold, and pushes the very boundaries of modern physics. It isn't just about things getting chilly, it's a complete, dramatic, molecular reorganization. Okay, let's dive into this. Here's the roadmap for our explainer today. First, we'll cover the magic of freezing. Then, water's weird expansion. Third, mapping phase changes. Fourth, defying the cold. And finally, we'll wrap up with the hidden phase transition. All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the magic of freezing. Let's look at what's actually happening at the atomic level. Now, the highly technical term for most freezing is crystallization. It's what's known as a first-order thermodynamic phase transition. But what does that actually mean for us? Well, as you lower a liquid's temperature below its freezing point, its molecules are drained of heat energy. And because they're losing that energy, they literally start to slow down. They stop just sliding and sloshing past each other and almost magically start lining up into this highly defined, neat periodic pattern. That pattern is what we call a crystal lattice. This whole crystallization thing really happens in two main steps. Step 1 is nucleation. Basically, tiny groups of molecules manage to clump together and form a super small solid seed. Now, this can happen entirely on its own. We call that homogeneous nucleation. But honestly, it usually relies on some tiny impurity, like a speck of dust or even a microscopic scratch on the container. We call that heterogeneous nucleation. Once that little seed hits a stable, critical size, boom, we hit step 2, crystal growth. The surrounding molecules just rapidly latch onto that seed, and the solid structure rapidly expands. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Because nucleation usually needs those little impurities to kick off, what happens if you have completely, perfectly pure liquid? Well, pure water without any dust or any of those nucleating agents, can actually be supercooled way, way past its normal freezing point. In fact, it can stay a liquid all the way down to -40 degrees Celsius. No way, right? It stays liquid until the molecules lose so much energy that homogeneous nucleation finally forces them to freeze. Moving right along to Section 2, water's weird expansion, because water is honestly the ultimate rebel. So, the golden rule in physics and chemistry is that liquids shrink when they freeze. They pack together and become denser. But water completely ignores this. The ultimate exception to the rule is that water actually expands when it turns to ice. But why? Normally, when something freezes, molecules lose energy, they pack tightly together, and they form a heavy, dense block. But water is made of polar molecules. You've got oxygen atoms pulling really tightly on hydrogen atoms. So as the temperature drops and they stop buzzing around so much, these hydrogen bonds pull the atoms into a very specific type of crystal lattice. And this specific shape actually forces the molecules to lock into a position that is farther apart than when they were just a free-flowing liquid. Because they're forced to spread out, ice ends up being less dense than liquid water, which is exactly why ice cubes float in your drink and why ice floats on top of a frozen lake, keeping all the fish below perfectly safe. Actually, water isn't the only total rule breaker out there. Get a load of helium-3 and helium-4. At absolute extreme freezing temperatures, we're talking below 0.3 Kelvin, helium-3 actually has a negative enthalpy of fusion. This creates a literal paradox. To freeze it at certain constant pressures, you have to add heat to the system. Let that sink in. You literally have to add heat to make it freeze. It's the only known substance where adding heat creates a solid phase under those conditions. Pretty mind-bending stuff. All right, on to Section 3, mapping phase changes. Let's look at the thermodynamic maps that govern all this. One of the absolute coolest things on these phase maps is something called the triple point. This is the precise, incredibly specific combination of temperature and pressure where the solid, liquid, and gaseous phases of a substance all exist together in perfect, stable equilibrium. For water, this magic balancing act happens at exactly 273.16 Kelvin and 611.657 pascals of pressure. If you hit that exact point, You would literally see water freezing, melting, and boiling, all at the exact same time. And this brilliantly illustrates the hardcore thermodynamics behind those maps. What we're looking at here is molar Gibbs free energy. Now, without getting completely lost in the math, just think of Gibbs free energy, where G equals H minus Ts, as the ultimate judge, jury, and executioner for phase changes. A system is always trying to find the lowest possible free energy state. So the exact moment where the free energy of the liquid phase perfectly matches the solid phase, that is the melting point. It's the exact thermodynamic tipping point that dictates the transition. Okay, here's another fact from those thermodynamic charts that feels totally backward. Freezing is an exothermic process. That means freezing actually releases heat. As liquid molecules lock themselves into a solid crystal lattice, they shed energy. We call this the latent heat of fusion. What this really means is that while a puddle of water is turning into ice, its temperature actually stays completely flat until the whole freezing process is 100% finished. You literally have to keep pulling that released heat away from the environment, or the freezing process will just completely stall out. Let's shift gears to Section 4, defying the cold. Because biology and industry are constantly battling this crystal lattice, nature is absolutely brilliant at manipulating freezing to its advantage. For example, there's this bacteria, Pseudomonas syringae, that actually cranks out specialized proteins just to force ice to form on plant leaves at a relatively warm, -2 degrees Celsius. It literally creates frostbite on purpose so it can feed on the plant's nutrients. On the flip side, you've got these tiny worms, nematodes, that can survive being frozen solid in liquid nitrogen for nearly a whole year. They use anti-nucleating proteins to stop sharp, deadly ice crystals from shredding their cells. We actually use similar cryopreservation tricks to safely freeze human embryos for decades. And in the industrial world, places like Patriot Foundry use specific alloys, like titanium boron, to tweak how liquid metal flows and crystallizes into a solid. We are just constantly fighting or trying to control exactly how that lattice forms. Finally, we arrive at Section 5, the hidden phase transition. Because sometimes there is no crystal at all. See, the thing is, not everything crystallizes. Things we use every single day, glass, plastics, they undergo a process called vitrification. They harden super gradually into amorphous solids without ever forming that neat, predictable crystal pattern. And because there's no sudden, abrupt phase change at one specific temperature, they technically don't even have a true freezing point. That plastic bottle or glass window you touch every day, in physics terms, it's actually best described as a supercooled liquid that is just flowing so unbelievably slowly that it feels perfectly solid. But how exactly does a supercooled liquid become so seemingly solid without crystallizing? Honestly, this has driven scientists crazy for decades. Kranthi Mandadapu from the Berkeley lab put it perfectly, saying, the whole quest is to understand microscopically what separates the supercooled liquid and a high-temperature liquid. And just recently, his team actually made a massive breakthrough, theorizing a hidden phase transition that kicks in at a very specific onset temperature. So, the crucial point is how they figured this out. The Berkeley team ran massive computer simulations of 2D supercooled liquids. They noticed that inside these super thick, gooey liquids, there are little localized movements of particles, which they started treating like defects in a solid lattice. They discovered that as you heat things up to this hidden onset temperature, pairs of these bound-together defects suddenly rip apart. This unbinding of defects is the exact microscopic split second when the system loses its rigid, solid-like grip and melts back into acting like a normal liquid. It is literally a hidden phase transition happening right under our noses in everyday glossy materials. Which leaves us with a genuinely mind-bending thought to wrap up this explainer. The next time you grab a plastic water bottle or lean against a glass window, ask yourself, are you actually touching a solid, or are you just holding a super cooled liquid, temporarily trapped in a highly viscous state by a hidden thermodynamic phase transition? The physics of freezing goes so much deeper than the ice cubes in our freezers. It literally dictates the structure of the entire material world around us. Thanks so much for diving into this explainer with me today, and keep questioning the world you see.